And our last talk of the day, Mr. Tim Crothers is going to be talking to us about deception for the win in 2023 and beyond. Let's welcome Tim.
Hello everybody. Thanks for sticking it out, and you brave souls who are missing the OAscent talk that I really wanted to be in, but they put us at the same time, so I guess I'll have to catch it on YouTube, so it's all good. So if any of you have heard me talk before, you have probably heard me talk about deception. It's becoming more and more and more important, in my opinion. And my goal today is to convince you of that, and to hopefully make it a lot easier for you to leverage in your environment to protect. So what is deception? Deception is a broad set of tools. In my references at the end, hopefully all of you have already read Chris Sanders' great book on honeypots and all of the other sorts of deception. That is one form, but that's actually not my preferred form. Probably relevant to the conversation, for those of you who are not aware, my day job, my team defends Mandiant. You may have heard of Mandiant. And, you know, there's some folks that just don't like us for some reason. Matter of fact, the group that's fortunately recently hit MGM, they in particular have been on a hunt for some of our folks. And so when you've got an environment, and I would argue any environment, not just kind of higher stakes ones like ours, there's what we have found a different way of kind of conceptualizing our defense. And we've taken to calling this layered defense. So what is layered defense? You're probably immediately going to, oh, defense in depth and et cetera. No, it's not that. It's a different kind of a way to think about how do we defend our organizations. So step one, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I ultimately believe that prevention will fail, right? If you're up against a sophisticated enough adversary, they're going to bring tooling that is going to get past your defensive layers. However, I also don't believe that means you have failed yet. Now, I would argue if you know, they've got initial access on my laptop, we're now in a race condition. It's now a race between us as defenders and the attackers. Can we eject them, contain them, stop them before they complete their objective, right? Before they deploy that ransomware, before they steal our intellectual property or whatever the heck they're intending to do, right? And so this is where the concept of a layered defense comes into play. So think of it this way, or this is how we think of it, I should say, maybe. Layer one is all of our standard controls, right? All of our firewalls and our intrusion detection, all of that great stuff that we use day in, day out as defenders to defend our organizations. That's our layer one defense. Now, if, like me, you believe that a sufficiently skilled adversary is going to penetrate layer one, that's where layer two comes into play. And the whole concept here is simply that layer two is all about your controls to know when layer one has failed so that you can eject that adversary from your environment. Does that make sense? Right? So simple concept here. This is nothing to, you know, against the one way or the other, right? In that layered defense, right? Layer one, all of your, you know, your zero trust architecture, all of these other things that we all know and love, at least if you're a defender. And then the layer two, things like behavioral detection, anomalistic activity detection. These are all great ways, you know, to figure out, all right, how do I know layer one has failed so that our defenders can find that adversary and get rid of them before they beat us. That's the whole idea. And one of the best ways to do that consistently and getting better and better and better is deception. And so with deception, in my case, the whole idea here is really simple. Here's my environment. I seed out a whole bunch of what we mostly call honey tokens. And I've created a hostile environment for the attacker, right? We, as defenders, have one advantage over those attackers, and it's our space. We should know that space, right? That home field advantage, so to speak. We can leverage that against those attackers, because all we need them to do, right, is bump into one of these, and we're off to the races. And of course, the advantage here for us as defenders is the attackers have needs, right? They need access credentials. If you were in Fernando's talk earlier, right, he showed a video of a ransomware actor on privileges looking for files with paths in it, right, and just looking for passwords so they can move laterally. They need to figure out the infrastructure. They need to figure out where our domain controllers or whatever our central root, authentication mechanism is in our environment. They're going to need things like, or want typically, things like documentation, right? We see a ton of threat actors go for things like our internal wiki documentation, because what do? We post passwords up there and all sorts of other things that help them to figure out how to get to, Fernando really described it well, right? They're trying to find the data that is interesting to them, ergo our crown jewels. Oop, PowerPoint crashed. Let's see if we can restart. Pardon the technical difficulties. This is what happens when you run a Microsoft product on a Mac. Oh, wait, did I say that out loud? I gotta. All right, so attackers' needs. All right, so this is what then we use against them. So part two, I mentioned I have two objectives for today. One, I'm hoping to convince you that if you are not leveraging deception in defending your environment, then you've got a gaping hole. You've got layer one, but you don't have layer two. You don't have a way of knowing that your layer one has failed, right? So, honey tokens. How does this work? Well, part of what I'm releasing today is a simple little open source tool, because honey tokens can be really difficult to manage, right? Let me back up slightly. So if this is the situation we're trying to do, each one of those little skulls I represented on my diagram is potentially an individual honey token. So that can be, if you want to roll your own. Now, there are some really great commercial products out there. If you've got bigger budgets, I'd highly recommend maybe go look at a Calvio or some of these sorts of things, because they simplify a lot of this. But obviously not all of us have these budgets, and in my case, they're just great research projects, right? I just love, digging in, building them, and figuring out. So the way the honey token process works is pretty straightforward. So here I've got a document, okay? And you notice I've got a little, let's see if I hit the right button here. Come on. Maybe I'll do it at my laptop, see if it does better there. There it goes. So notice the little, nope, none of it showed it. There we go. I'm clearly not functioning well on technology today. The simplest little honey token, and they're used today on you a lot for email tracking purposes, are little 1 pixel by 1 pixel transparent images. Trivial to build, throw that in any document today, right? And that makes a callback to my little backend that I'm open sourcing today. What that does is writes out a really easy to parse, so you can integrate it into your SIM. So hopefully, all of us here are Security Onion users. We can easily pull that in to set off the alert, right? The goal of my thing, and it's super simple. I'm really hoping some of you who are way better at Python than I am will pick it up and take it a lot further than I have taken it. But there's two things we want to do. All of those honey tokens, we want to be able to know where that honey token is placed, so that, let's say that document is opened because it's sitting on, I don't know, I'll pick on somebody in the audience like Jason here. Jason's got this clear text, password document sitting on his desktop. Adversary has, gotten onto his laptop because blood level in his caffeine system was a little too high, and he clicked on that malicious link. And so they open that document so that they can get the passwords out of it because, Jason conveniently called it passwords.txt or whatever, right? Well, what that does is that hits over to the web file. We want to know that's from Jason's laptop because as defenders, we want to go know where the adversary is to go step on them, right? To go eject them out of our environment. So that's what I'm releasing today. So it's Honey Token HTTP. It's been a long day. Obviously out there on my GitHub, and it's does this by really accomplishing two things, and I'll do a demo here of it in just a second. So it creates a simple little catalog file, okay? So what happens is it's a web interface that just runs as localhost. You don't need to run it as admin because running things as admin on critical servers is not really a good security practice. So you point all of these various Honey tokens, and I'm going to go through a whole bunch more approaches to accomplishing this in just a minute. But you point these to that, right? And then it looks up the Honey token based upon the incoming URL, and then that's how we know, oh, this was Tim's laptop, or Blake's laptop, or critical domain server, whatever it is that we've placed this on, right? So let me do just that. I'm going to little video here to walk through. If I can find my. So what I've got going here are a couple different windows. So up in the top, I'm going to do a get download of the Honey Token HTTP. I've got the get page up here on the side here. Standard, do a get clone, bring it down. You'd think all these years I could type faster than that, but what do you do? I could speed up the video, but then that's cheating, I feel like. All right, so I'm just doing a quick cat out on the file, right? Standard practice, right? It's showing you all of the command lines. And we crashed again. Goodness. All right, well, I've got the file locally. Some key here's thing, I wanted, of course, this completely customizable because all of our environments are a little different, right? You've got the output files. And what I'm showing here is it's simply just standard HTTP receipt. What I wanted to do is just make it really robust. It looks up in the catalog file and uses that to figure out which token it is. And so now I'm going to show the token files. Right? And the idea here being is this is our token catalog. We just give it an ID. You can use whatever you want, where it's at, and what the alert message you want to fire in your SIM when you integrate it into your SIM. Okay? And so I'm just going to tail the log file there, created the quick log file. The log file is what you'll ingest with your SIM, right, locally on your host. And then we'll fire up some of them. So there's the different command line parameters. You can obviously run it on whatever host name and port you want, specify which catalog file you want, and of course what output file you want it to log to collect into your SIM. Really simple Python project here, nothing fancy. But what this does is lets you easily create a simple naming convention that works for your environment so that you can do it. So I'm hitting the running Honey Token HTTP, and you can see I've got an alert, a message that fired, and then of course you can see that it logged to the local thing. Now in this case, because I'm using the browser, the getFaveIcon.ico is just a standard thing that's done as part of the get process. When you actually do it from the Honey token, you won't get some of that extraneous noise. But then if we go up and we go over to the catalog file here a second, should be coming up momentarily. Move this out of the way. So now I'm actually going to put a token or a legitimate token in there. Notice that it fires the alert token access from Tim's PC, right? Again, I designed this to be really simple to integrate, but what I'll say is if you pick fairly straightforward naming convention, you can really simply deploy this. Let's just say I've spoiled a whole bunch of red team operations at Mandiant, which Evan and team didn't appreciate, but hey, it's our job as defenders to stop them, so it is what it is. All right, so let's talk about types. How do you use these? Where would you put these out here? Well, as I mentioned, the simplest one is a WebBug URL token approach, right? So key there is it's a unique URL, okay? The Honey token HTTP will accept any URL. Basically what it's doing is it's using the URL that's called to it to figure out, it just looks that up in the catalog and that's how it knows which token is called in. So that makes it really easy to run. Most often I would suggest just use a one by one transparent. So uses for these, you can throw these into email, non-linked web pages. We may have thrown some of these in Kevin Mandiant's email, just in case Red Team started looking through Kevin's email, hypothetically speaking. What about accounts? Simple, right? Create an account in AD or whatever source you're using, right? I would optionally recommend scripting a simple little local login, right? That's an easy way to call out the Honey token piece of this, right? Then I would suggest disable the account and, of course, enable alerting on attempted login, or you can use a specific Honey token with this as well, right? Tempting administrative accounts, lateral movement detection, embedded secrets, right? I like GitHub code laying around that has embedded secret code in it that refers to these, right? Or our aforementioned, password file sitting on Jason's desktop. Any and all of these, right, are just a great way to go. What about AWS tokens? Again, super simple to do, right? So this is the format for the AWS CRED file, right? You just set up, the secret access key, et cetera, and you put it in the .aws/credentials in home directories scattered around your environment. You can, again, put this in local code repositories. Internal code documentation is a great place to put some of this stuff, right? Because these are the things, the places that the adversaries are going to find this stuff. Kubeconfig. We're seeing a ton of targeting on Kubernetes K8's infrastructure, right? So again, we generate a Kubernetes account, create an access config file, disable the account, alert on attempted access. Really straightforward to set this up. Still with me? Folder tokens, this one's kind of a fun one. This is an old call out to good old Windows and their mechanism. So the key here is you've got to create this desktop ini with this shell class info. And the simplest way to alert on this one is to monitor DNS calls for it. That's the simplest way I've found to use this one. You can throw these out all in all sorts of places. So, on and on and on. The key here is we're trying to create a hostile environment for the adversaries. We want there to be enough seated around the environment that the adversary is very likely to bump into it as they're trying to get to whatever they're trying to get to, right? The other beauty of deception is most of this has a very, very low false positive ratio, right? When you're putting this out, our legitimate folks don't need to use this, don't need to go looking for this. If it triggers and it is one of our internal users, then they're probably just snooping around, learning, something like that. Pretty easy to sort all of those things out. There's very, very few things that can't be turned into a honey token. And this is where, in particular, some of the commercial options nowadays really shine. I've seen things like fake AV, right? So again, if you watched Fernando's talk, he talked about them using a tool to disable the antivirus. And that was actually the initial clue that went them searching for the bad guy. And so again, some of the stuff can feed that out and immediately alert, right? These are just some other things that we've tried that we've had some fun luck with. We didn't really get any good results out of the QR codes, but it was interesting to play with anyway. GitHub Actions is a fun one. You can, if you've got some repositories that you're using as honey tokens, you can easily configure some GitHub Actions for, downloads and things like that on those repositories, for instance. Of course, custom binaries, I love to set up all sorts of stuff. So, how do you've decided, all right, Tim, you've convinced me. How do you go about doing this? Well, if you want to use honey token HTTP, it's pretty straightforward. Step one, figure out a naming convention. Just pick some sort of a naming convention that you want to use for distributing your honey tokens. What we typically have done is we'll use kind of a prefix that's based upon the type of token, right? So if it's a web bug that we're going to put in documents and stuff like that, will be WB underscore to start the naming, right? And then we have a system ID that we use, which we tend to keep separate from the actual system because you do want to be careful, especially your more sophisticated adversaries. You got to, the trickiest bit of this is you want this to look realistic, right? You don't want it to look fake or an obvious lure. Don't make it so obvious. But think about where they're going to need to go, right? This is where, in particular, I would recommend planning out, especially your first round of honey tokens, where you go, all right, here's key data that would be incredibly harmful to us if this was ransomware. All right, what's the access paths to get to those data so you can make sure and set up some tripwires on the path to those, right? And then I would definitely start with web tokens just because they're the simplest. It's super trivial to generate one-by-one transparent pixels and throw those into documents, throw those into, you can even throw them into the templates, so that if you've got groups creating, they're already in, there's lots of things. Then step two is I would absolutely go for account tokens. Right? Now, the trickiest bit with the account token stuff is you don't want to just create the account. You also need that account to have logged in places, right? Because think about how the most common way they're going to get these creds out is they're going to scrape them out of memory, right? They're going to get on my laptop, pull all of the locally cached credentials in my laptop. So that means you've got to have some of these credentials locally cached. But that's fairly straightforward to do with some modern tooling, your SCCM type stuff, your, so on and so forth. So account tokens. And then third, I would suggest what I mentioned earlier, right? Figure out what do you think are your prime targets. If ransomware is a concern, I would focus on things like, well, what are our operational key systems in the environment? Again, what are those access paths to those? And take some of those sorts of things. Some additional resources. I mentioned this earlier. As always, Mr. Sanders does an amazing job. Always writes great books. This is much more detailed than obviously I have time to cover today. He also covers much more of the depth and breadth, full honeypots and stuff like that. Also, I highly recommend go take a look at canarytokens.org. They've got free resources to generate these tokens for you. And of course, you can then quickly modify them to work with HTTP, honeytoken HTTP, and get that integrated in. So again, if you're learning, that's a great way to start. And I kind of slammed through that really, really quick. Yes, questions?
So you mentioned the layered defenses that you have.
Yeah.
The layer 1, which has love as your trust button, and the main thing you're talking was a deception for layer 2.
Yeah.
And as you got later in the talk, I started thinking about some things you were talking about with is it possible like that EDR and some of the other I don't name any tools, but like systems that monitor poly open, like a little system carbon black. Somebody tries to, so is it possible with these, I guess our question goes like using layer 1 to detect access for layer 2. So you have logging at the bin when the files are accessed. So if you have like a honey token on your computer,
Mm-hmm.
and I know you're going to get logging from the token from like your SIM and
Yep.
security and the other stuff, but integrating with some other layer 1 tools.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So his question is, I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, right? Can we use some of our layer 1 stuff, like, say you're using CrowdStrike or any of these sorts of things, right? You can absolutely use those to monitor the layer 2 stuff, right? The whole idea here is really just when we're planning out our defenses, where we've found this so useful as a construct is when we're thinking through completeness, right? All right, because layer 1, right, our standard defenses, those are critically important, whether you take defense in depth approach or zero, trust or whatever, that's a distinct thing. And then we think of our layer 2 just from the perspective of how do we build controls to know when layer 1 has failed. Now, you can use layer 1 to assist with that for sure, right? I would argue your SIM is part of your layer 1 if you're even just doing the alerting through that, right? And some of these other ones, like behavioral detection, are a really great one too, that you can still do with your layer 1 stuff, but you're going to have to build some custom signatures, right? So like, let's give a specific example. Part of what really got my team thinking about this and focusing on this is we saw a defense industrial contractor back last fall. Chinese threat actor group used 3 O-days, 3 distinct different O-days, and deployed a malware framework that runs natively in the hypervisor on ESX. So of course, we're like, holy smokes, how do we, Kevin Mandia has taken to calling these the apex attackers, right? How do we, and they're being very intentional. We're seeing a lot of intentionality, right? Think about all of the work done, great work, over the last few years over around EDR and maturing a lot of our EDR. So now we're seeing the threat actors being intentional to avoid EDR. How do they avoid EDR? Well, that's a talk all by itself, but one of the key ways is they attack through systems you can't run EDR on. So in this case, the first O-day was against the external internet-facing firewall, okay? I'm not going to name the organization to preserve the maybe blameless, I don't know. But that got them resident at the firewall layer. Then from there, they deployed another O-day against core switch, which allowed them to move to the core switch. And then from the core switch, they deployed an O-day against ESX, which allowed them to get into ESX unauthenticated, where they could then deploy their malware framework that could inject malware into all of the virtual machines running under that hypervisor. So in that instance, right? There was no EDR anywhere that we could have deployed, if we as defenders are trying to defend that. But if you've done like we have done and you've gone, all right, let's look at all of how admins access the firewalls and build custom behavioral detection around that use. Because while the attackers, can access those devices, they are going to use them differently than our legitimate people do. And it's actually pretty simple to build some behavioral detection around those systems that goes, now those tend to be pretty high false positive, but again, you're not going to deploy those everywhere. You're going to deploy those over some key critical systems that you might think might be the main types of pathing that an adversary would use in these sorts of instances, right? And so that's another great way, which you can, again, use a lot of that layer one. But the reason why I become a fan of this thinking about it as layer one and layer two is just buckets of type, right? So at the end of the day, I want to have a ton of stuff in the layer one, and I all of my standard testing to make sure that's working as best as possible. But then I also want to, as intentionally, go through and say, well, how do I detect all of the key ways that they might have bypassed those layer one controls so that I can game on, right? We measure our, one of our KPIs is containment time. And right now we're running about 12 and a half minutes on average, right? The idea there doesn't give adversary very much time to hurt us meaningfully, right? Well, you can only get there if you've got really good processes, really good people, and right, that whole thing is predicated on that you've got a prevention failure that you can go chase in the first place. I saw a hand over here.
How do you prevent your backup, antivirus, whatever your normal systems from tripping the?
You mean in terms of like the behavioral or the honey tokens? So that's just a matter of how you deploy the honey tokens. I mean, occasionally you'll get, people are curious or whatever, but 99% of the time it's red team that we're catching with the honey tokens. It's really just, you want to be very thoughtful about, this is a super simplified map, but I would take the actual infrastructure and if you're using segmentation, okay, how is our coverage within the different segments and stuff, right? I've got, security architects and people that are way smarter than me that do all the real work on this stuff, just to be clear. But you want to, that's why I really like the layer one, layer two approach, is because we are as intentional about figuring out where and how to place our layer two controls as we are layer one controls. Does that make sense? Answer it? Question in the back?
Yeah, so one thing on the honey account tokens, just an observation that I've made is do not give them too much privilege. We had a victim organization of our EDR service who they actually not only made the honey user account look juicy, they gave it domain admin privilege.
Oh. Yeah, that's a good call out. Note in the slide that I covered that, I specifically said disable account, but that's a good call out too, is make sure that account cannot be burned, cannot be used against you. That was good. And Blake, I think you had your hand up.
When the token is tripped, are you more in a watch and learn state or is swift remediation?
Oh, that's a good question. So Blake's question was, when the token is tripped, are we in a watch and learn? Unless there's some really extenuating circumstances, since this is all operational environment, we are shut them down. We will early, and a lot of other organizations take this approach nowadays too, I know. When you think about the problem of breach prevention from the context of we lose when they complete whatever their outcome that they're trying to achieve, right? And you really start thinking that through, Blake, you realize that, look, we need to know really two things before we contain. do we have it fully scoped, i.e. do we know everywhere the adversary is and what they've done? And, you know, 2, what are they doing, you know, so that we can contain it using appropriate controls, right? Then you have plenty of time to go back and do all of the research, et cetera, right? I wouldn't recommend, except in rare circumstances. You know, at one point in my career, I was at GE, and we may or may not have been, you know, having some jousting with nation-state actors. This is 2010, 2011. And the CIO gave us permission to observe up to exfil. If we saw what looked like exfil, we'd cut it off, right? And that was invaluable, but that was a really rare circumstance because, one, it's super risky, right? You can easily lose control on that scenario, and they can evade you, you know, depending on your visibility, et cetera. So you gotta be super, super careful with that. So 1, that's risky, and 2, the other extenuating circumstance there is this is the very early days of the nation-state actor stuff, and nobody really understood them. And so we really had a critical need to figure out how they worked. But short of something crazy like that, and I'd make sure that highest level executive you could get in to sign off on. Now, that's where, though, you know, there's lots of great, you know, stand-up non-production instance on your cloud provider of choice and build up some stuff there to observe, you know, actors. Yes, sir?
So kind of going on to that a little bit, do you ever feel like you have enough fidelity in your honey tokens or whatever to take an automated action against these guys?
We do, yeah. We don't currently take automated actions because I'm still a fan of having the human brain in the loop. But would I feel comfortable in taking automated actions? I actually would, yeah. Yeah, like think about the honey tokens that we're deploying on end user laptops. I really wouldn't lose any sleep on taking an automated, you know, action that just dropped, you know, local IPsec policies on that laptop and cut off access, for instance, right? You still want to be careful there, right? Because the biggest problem with the automated action versus a human brain analysis is you want to be confident on how they got to that laptop, that they aren't other places. Because what you might have done is just shunted them, and so I would lean against that, but I would certainly consider it depending on what the environment looked like. Sir?
Yeah, I have a question about, you mentioned the insiders that may find honey accounts and passwords and stuff. Have you explored gamifying that with the staff and actually rewarding funds?
I have not. No, that's a very interesting thought. My only concern with that would be that they find a bunch of the honey tokens, then we got to deploy new ones. It is a fair bit of work to, you know, unless you're using one of the, you know, the better commercial products, it's a lot of work to deploy these manually. But even that, to the gamifying point, I can speak to that. You know, your SOC and a lot of these groups, this is such a different thing than their normal SOC grind that it's also a really fun project for folks to work on that helps with the, you know, the SOC burnout stuff, et cetera, right? So I do think there's, even beyond the detection, additional benefits. Thought I saw another hand. Yes, sir?
In your experience with the deception accounts, files, et cetera,
Yeah.
how much effort is worth building a false persona for these things? Having an account that's created not yesterday, that has been logged into,
Yeah.
all of that.
That's a good question. So is, yeah. So his question is, how much effort is it worth it? In my opinion, it's worth a lot of effort. And I think the trick there is to weave it into your normal processes, right? I wouldn't recommend go hogtail into deception to start, right? Go slow, start rolling it out, you know, et cetera. That's going to get you some of that age, and then just seed it over time. So, you know, you've got your SOC folks doing an hour a week on it or something like that, right? And so it becomes something interesting for them to sink their teeth into, you know, and work on. but isn't a huge project per se. I would tend to balance it, something like that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I just had a comment that, I own Honey accounts and passwords into myself.
Yeah.
Just inject some net exe data with password exposures, and that makes sure that my security, my SOC security.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a technique we used back at GE incredibly successfully. We had threat actor who was very, very successful at compromising AD creds. And so we actually did the reverse, right? So if you look at the tools for pulling the creds, we seeded a bunch of fake in there, and then built some custom detection, looking for those creds flowing across the wire, because the only time those creds that we had added would flow across the wire is if we have a threat actor dumping the domain, right? So you can go both directions with this, just FYI. And we had a lot, unfortunately, we had one domain admin got popped 25 times in the course of about 11 months. So, yeah. It was interesting. Sir?
So, assuming your thoughtfully is on what you feel about saturating the environment with honey tokens to try to maximize your chances to catch the intruder versus placing them only in, say, the high value areas.
Yeah. So his question, for those who couldn't hear, was what are thoughts on saturating them out there versus, look, if I was going to use automation for it, I would absolutely go for that path, right? I wouldn't do it manually. That I think would be too much work. But if I built some tooling as part of my patch management systems and some of the other where we could easily deploy some of that, right? I would think about that. If I was going to go that way, though, that's probably where I'd seriously look at some of the commercial options, right? The commercial options are doing things like, I can only speak to one particular one, but Acalvio, they have integrated with Windows Defender and CrowdStrike both, and actually leveraged those platforms to deploy a bunch of these things. And so it makes it super easy to deploy these in a saturated fashion. And so if you had automation or something like that, I would absolutely go that path. But at some point there, if you're trying to roll your own, like I've been showing, and with my little open source, your amount of labor probably will exceed what you could pay a commercial, organization to get you. Yes, sir.
So along those lines a little bit, what about the refresh cycle, or like automation, but like refreshing the tokens, as new things come online, adding
Yeah.
or sort of automate some of the deployment,
Yeah.
or using them to sort of make them findable.
Yeah. Well, it'd be pretty straightforward to make this part of the build process. We actually haven't done that yet, but that's kind of been on my roadmap for a while hey, we issue a new laptop to a user as part of the new laptop build process. Let's deploy token as part of that. So I do think there's some things like that I would consider probably doing to that point. Yeah. Sir?
So I'm a fan of the CIS security controls.
Mhm.
More from a perspective of, is an organization doing it as a fundamentals? You can always spend certain money here and there.
Yep.
But then I was just applying that to the deceptions.
Mm.
Can I look at the 18 security controls and then say, do I have deception coverage in those 18 areas? Have you gone down that path of thinking and trying to maybe go wide in your deceptions?
But short, TLDR, yes. Not specifically to the CIS controls, we weren't doing it that, but more as an exercise on how creative can we get on, and again, my team and I treated this kind of as a research project of sorts, right, where we really wanted to try and explore where are they highly valuable, where are they not, things like that. But a lot of that was informed because we do have the advantage of seeing a lot of real intrusions and a lot of real activity, and kind of tailoring our choices to some of that observability for sure. Other questions? This is why I kept the content shorter, is because I was hoping it would stir more conversation than me lecturing at all of you. That's just not my preferred. If there are no more questions, another question?
What type, maybe this is kind of a not important question, but what type of pushback do you get on deceptions from either individuals or CISOs, or people just say, hey, this is bullshit?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I talk about this to peers, I find this is an area that a lot of people just aren't familiar with. I started playing with deception back in the early 2000s, so I'm probably at a decade of using deception, and obviously it's morphed extensively over time as I've continued to lean into this. But I think it's just a pathway that leads to all sorts of interesting, kind of, and at the end of the day, it's just, like I say, that's the whole layer 1, layer 2. It's a supplement, right? It's just there as a backstop for when our other stuff goes. So
there is a fine line though when you start trying to catch insiders.
Oh yeah.
You can get in big trouble there, right?
You could potentially, right? Like again, you want to think about this as, our context, we're putting this out essentially as bait on the things that we know attackers go for, right? I've never really put any brain cycles into using it for insider. That's certainly not where I would take this, because then you get into the very gray areas of entrapment, which is a legal thing, and that's not the kind of work environment or culture I want to live in. And I suspect, hopefully, none of you do either.
And that's why I suggested gamification instead of rewarding.
Yeah.
Than using it for negative.
Yeah. No, it's definitely an interesting thought. I will put some more thought at it. I do. Gamification can have a lot of positive benefits for sure. All right. Last call for another question. Then I have a question. All right, so I have here a Bash Bunny to hand out. For the question, name one of the top tools for extracting cached credentials on a Windows host. I saw your hand first. Mimikatz it is. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for your attendance. And, hey, before we leave, could I also get everybody to give a round of applause for, we got a ton of volunteers, B-Sides Augusta makes no money, right? This is all a whole lot of hardworking, passionate people put this together, ton of volunteers that have been working for months, let alone all the long hours they put in today. And I just, couldn't be prouder of the work that they do for all of us as a community. So I would ask that we all give them a round of applause. All right. Thanks, everybody.